We're in chapter 7, and this evening we're going to be speaking about, can your soul become overweight? Now, this is a direct follow-on from the idea that you can't put on weight on Shabbos. Yes? Remember that concept that you can't gain weight on Shabbos? So this is now the other side of it. So if you can't gain weight on Shabbos, if your body cannot gain weight on Shabbos, which we've proven to be a fallacy, that it is actually possible for the body to put on weight on Shabbos, guess what? In case you were surprised by that, the bathroom scale is not so surprised. So now we're going to look at the reverse. In the same way as the principle of not gaining weight on Shabbos, we learned actually means that the physical experience of eating cannot bog you down spiritually because it's Shabbos. So now we're going to ask the question from a different perspective, and that is it possible for something to happen that will make not the body overweight, that will make the soul overweight? In other words, this chapter 7, introduced us to a principle of what is called, remember what it's called? Klipas Noiga. Klipas Noiga is the gray area. It's the parts of life that are not naturally holy and spiritual, the parts of life that are naturally neutral, and it really depends what it is that you do with them, and that will decide if they are going to turn holy or if they're not going to turn holy. Okay, so that's basically what Klipas Noiga is. And we said that the nature of Klipas Noiga is that it is, they have the thing downstairs. They're opening from downstairs. Sorry, just we're running two functions over here, so they've got the control for the gate downstairs, so people will hopefully get in. We hope. Anyway, so what happens with Klipas Noiga? It hasn't got a value of either being holy or being impure. It's really up to us. It depends what we do. So if we attribute a particular value to something, then that becomes its value. That's the theme of this chapter. So far what we've learned is that it's possible for a person to have, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, it is possible for a person to have a ribeye steak, and it could be a holy experience. It's possible. And it's possible to have a joke. The rabbi can tell a joke, and the joke could be holy. That's also possible. And how did that happen? Well, we said because if a person is eating the meat in order to have protein, in order to sharpen their mind, in order to be able to learn Torah better, great, fantastic, that will elevate the meat and it will become a holy experience. And if a person is telling a joke, because that will create rapport between the teacher and the student, and that will open up the shiur, and then it's going to be possible for us to learn Torah, then suddenly that joke is a holy joke, bearing in mind, of course, it has to be an acceptably kosher joke before it could become a holy joke. Right? If the joke is completely inappropriate, obviously it is not going to be elevated. So that was on the positive side, and that's what we learned about in the last two lessons. Tonight we're going to speak about the other side. What if we get it wrong? What if we don't land up elevating this Klipas Noiga? What if we don't transform something from being mundane and ordinary to become holy? Then what? Does it just remain neutral? No, there's no such thing as anything. Once a human being, particularly a Jewish person, engages with an item, it can no longer be parav. Now, it's either going to transform into something which is elevated and holy, or it is going to transform into something, as we're about to discuss in this next part of the chapter, that is ballast, that is an anchor, that is like wearing those beautiful shoes, from the mafia, that drag a person down. So that's what we're going to be learning about in this piece. So if you have a look inside the Tanya, it's on page 28. And more specifically, there is about 6 or 7 lines from the bottom of the page. There is a period, a full stop. That's where we are. Just after that, the word is ach. Okay, so you see where it is? Like six or 7 lines from the bottom of the page. Middle of the line. I'm going to pop it up on the screen also for those who are on the Zoom. So let me just get to the place, and let's now see the other side, the not so happy side, the side of what happens if a person does things wrong. Okay, so that's where we're going from here. Okay, so on the screen it's weird because the layout of the Tanya that we use on the screen is quite different to the actual book. So instead of being towards the bottom of the page, over here it's actually the top of the page. Okay, so there we go. It's page 28, and we're looking at either 6 or 7 lines from the bottom of the page. Maybe Steve could just show you exactly where it is. The word is ach. Okay, so now we're looking at the flip side. The flip side is the person who doesn't get it right. Okay, doesn't elevate their potential neutral Klipas Noiga They don't elevate it into becoming something holy. So what happens? What's the alternative? Okay, let's have a look. But mi shehu bezoilele basar v'soive yayin. What happens if a person is, for lack of a better word, a glutton? Now, the expression that he uses over here is, he uses two possibilities, zoilele basar and soive yayin, which basically means that a person is a glutton either with regards to meat or with regards to wine. Okay, so those are the classics. Bear in mind, in those days, it's not like they had sushi in those days. I guarantee you, if they did have sushi, it would have appeared in the Gemara as one of the examples of how people can overindulge. And they did not have all the ranges of drinks that we have. So the one drink of pleasure was wine. So that's why those are the two examples. Now, before we go any further, before we explore this further, I have to raise one controversial issue. Just before we go any further. Okay, one controversial issue. And that is there an outright law in the Torah against substance abuse? So in other words, it could be alcohol, it could be some other kind of mind-altering material. So is there anything in the Torah that is specific, that says, thou shalt not use? Is there such a law in the Torah? Anybody familiar with such a law? No, you're not familiar, right? Certainly not in those words. However, there is a very interesting law, and it's relevant to what we're going to be talking about over here this evening, and that is the law known as the Ben Sorer Umoire, the so-called rebellious son. And effectively, the law goes as follows. It's a bizarre scenario. You have a child who is literally on the cusp of bar mitzvah, and within a period of 6 months, goes full delinquent, to the point that they steal from their parents. It's a very rough story. And the Ben Sorer Umoire, if nobody is able to rein them in within this short period of a few months, it's actually a death penalty. Now, the whole thing starts with gluttony. That's where it starts. With overindulgence in specifically meat and wine. Zoilel and soive, those are the words. Zoilel is the word that we use to express gluttony when it comes to eating meat. In fact, there's even a discussion about what constitutes gluttony. It's not only about the quantity of meat, even though he eats a massive quantity of meat. There's also a discussion about how well cooked the meat is. Okay, so we're not going to go into that now. And soive is the word that is used to represent a person who overindulges in alcohol. In those days, it was wine. So it's a very bizarre law, especially when you consider that most of the commentators say there was never such a case in the history of the Sanhedrin. Nowadays it would be irrelevant, right? Because we don't have the capacity to execute somebody. But in the time in history where we had a Sanhedrin that could execute people, this case, which is a capital case, never once happened. So now you've got to ask yourself a simple question. What's the question? Why does the Torah, exactly, why does the Torah speak about a case that is purely hypothetical? What's the point? And because of that, there are certain commentators, including some more contemporary commentators, who say, because the Torah wants us to know that overindulgence in anything physical is problematic. Much more so if it's the kind of thing that could create an addiction and a reliance on some kind of a substance that would replace what we're really supposed to do in life, which is to work through issues and work through pain, etc., etc. So it's quite interesting that that's actually the basis in halachic literature against substance abuse. Very interesting. So coming back to our conversation, we're talking about the person who overindulges in meat and in wine. Now, do such people exist in the Jewish community? Have you ever, in your life, have you ever encountered Jews who overindulge? God forbid. I saw an advert today. Somebody sent me an advert today that the person who sent it was not sending it with a complimentary intention. So I don't know where in the world this is from. It's not from South Africa. But it's a bird's eye view of a tray. The tray is literally from one end to the other completely covered in salamis and different types of cold meats and whatever, like a whole selection. Okay? It's obviously for some either deli or butchery or whatever it is, and it's a Purim advert. They're advertising the food that they could supply with for you for Purim. And the tagline on the ad says this: the sons of Haman are not the only thing you can take in one breath. Because when you read the Megillah, you have to say about the 10 sons of Haman and how they were hanged, you have to do it in one breath. So that's obviously what they're playing on. So here they've got this thing. Just picture the scene. I'd love to know if we could teleport through time, right? Imagine you had a time machine. So if we could time travel back to the time of the Gemara and show them this, well, how do you think they would respond? I think they'd be horrified. I think they would be absolutely horrified that somebody believes that Purim should be represented by a tray of salami. Purim is a celebration of huge miracles, about the uniqueness of the Jewish identity, that people were willing to put their lives on the line in order to protect. That's what Purim is. You've reduced it to a tray of salami. So zoilele basar, yes, the idea of indulging in meat, unfortunately, I don't think is something that has escaped the Jewish community. We don't have it. We don't have the word here, but in the frum world in the United States, they use the word shmorg. Have you ever heard this word? Shmorg. Okay, maybe I'm not pronouncing it with enough of an R because it's an American word, right? The shmorg. What is a shmorg? You never heard of it, right? I knew you'd never heard of it because we don't have it over here. Shmorg is the way they've taken the word smorgasbord and they've created a slang word, the shmorg. I never knew what it was. For years I heard people speak about it. I had no idea what it was. And there's this obsession with the shmorg, right? Yeah, it's the best part of the wedding. The fact that a couple got married, no. The fact that there's food, there you go. That's the biggest thing, right? The shmorg. So we kind of just take it in step. We don't even question it. We don't even think about it. Jews and food. I recently saw a Jewish comedian. I didn't watch their show. I saw a clip of a Jewish comedian. So he was saying, most people think that to Jewish people, the most important thing in the world is money. The only people who think that are people who are not Jewish. If you're Jewish, you know the most important thing is food. Money is secondary, right? So we take it in stride. This is how we are. This is the Jewish people. Es mein Kind, just eat. That's how we resolve all of our problems. There's nothing in the world that chicken soup cannot cure. So here the Alter Rebbe says that's actually not Judaism. It might be Jewish culture. It may be something that has developed over centuries of deprivation on the one hand, and so we have this urgent need to always provide. And on the other hand, it's part of our nature because we are, by nature, very keen on providing, nurturing, and nourishing people. That's how we are as Jewish people. That's Jewish culture. That's not Judaism. And we have to be really clear that we don't confuse the two. Because there are many things that have become part of Jewish culture that are not necessarily Judaism. Interesting. So why is he telling us this? Because he says, Mishu b'zoleh basav asova yain, if a person indulges in the pleasures of meat and drink, of food and drink, lemalois tavas gufoi, with the sole intention of satisfying personal desire. Okay? When last did you see a whole lot of people standing around a braai saying, this is for the sake of heaven, even though it's a burnt offering, right? You stand around a braai, what's the motivation? You don't know how good these chops are going to be. You've never seen, every person who makes a braai thinks that they're the only person in the world who knows how to make a braai. So if you would know how this is going to taste, right? And then they tell you, I can't give you the exact details, but I marinated it like this, and I put on that seasoning, and a whole ganze Geschäft. Nobody can for 1 second suggest that is a divine-oriented experience. That is a self-oriented experience, which is it's not evil, it's natural. It's the nature of any living creature to satisfy itself. And human beings are amongst the very unique class of creatures who do things only for self-satisfaction. Now, most creatures do things for survival. There are exceptions. It's been proven that certain mammals do things simply for pleasure. But we're in that unique class of that small amount of life on earth that does things just for ourselves. because it makes me feel good. Right? So nobody in the world has yet to come up with a way to explain that they're eating ice cream for nutritional value. Right? Why are you eating ice cream? Because I like ice cream. That's it. Well, maybe you'll say because it puts me in a good mood, right? That's generally the chocolate. That's where the chocolate comes in, right? Chocolate is a mood-enhancing substance, which might also have addictive qualities. So that's what he's telling us up here. We have to recognize that to engage and indulge in something which is kosher doesn't mean the act is kosher. To put it differently, just because food is kosher doesn't mean eating it is a mitzvah. I'll give you an interesting example. So recently, you may have seen that there's certain products that have come with the hechsher, with the certification of the Beis Din, here in Johannesburg, in South Africa. Certain products, when you read the labels, you think, how could this possibly ever be kosher? So for example, you get shrimp-flavored chips. Kosher under the Beis Din. You're also like, how does that work? So the principle is, just because it's kosher doesn't mean it's a mitzvah. Technically, it checks the boxes for kashrus. It is not treif, which means it's not stuck in the world of impurity, in the world of klippa. That doesn't mean it's automatically healthy. And again, people make a similar mistake. They think if I make a brocha before I eat the food, that automatically cleanses it and automatically makes it holy. That's also not true. Okay, don't ask me what on earth happened over here to the screen sharing. It just put up something, I don't even know where it came from. Just put up a picture. I don't know, the Tanya has disappeared. You'll excuse me for a second. Tanya has completely disappeared off my computer. And instead it put a random picture from a number of years ago from a program we ran over here at Shul. Okay, so just forgive me for a second as I try and work out what on earth happened. And if I can retrieve the Tanya without doing too much damage. There we go. Okay, the Tanya is back. Let's put it back up on the screen. Okay, so what are we saying? So just because something is kosher does not mean that it is automatically a mitzvah, and therefore if a person indulges and the focus of the indulgence is self, we're going to discover that makes the person start to sink, as we'll see. So the intention that the person has is, I just want to make myself feel good. I enjoy this, and that's what I want to eat. You know, one of my favorite analogies for this particular context is the guy who walks into a restaurant. Have you ever heard the story of the beggar who walks into the restaurant? Know the story, the beggar who walks into the restaurant? It's not a story that happens very often, and it's not just a restaurant, it's one of these Michelin restaurants. It's like the creme de la creme. It's, what's his name's restaurant? What's his name? The big chef? Gordon Ramsay, right? Okay, so it's Gordon Ramsay's restaurant. And in walks some fellow off the street. And the staff, the manager, whoever it is of the restaurant is feeling very benevolent. So they give him a seat. They say, you know what, Nebuch, poor guy, he hasn't eaten. They give him a seat and they say, pick something off the menu and you can eat it. Obviously he doesn't know what all these fancy things are, all the names are. He just puts his finger down, he sees something, chooses, bring me that. Sitting one table over is some big deal, some big knacker, restaurant critic, one of these people, a judge from MasterChef, sitting at the next table with his wife. Okay, so now you have these two tables. The one has this beggar, literally off the street. They bring the food. He's never seen food like this in his life. He doesn't understand the concept of cutlery. There's food. He's hungry. He takes it with his hand, starts eating the food. That's what happens. And he doesn't eat in the most, shall we say, edel, refined way. He's chewing loud, his mouth open, and stuffing the food in, he's making a mess. The patrons of the restaurant looking, everybody's very uncomfortable, and, they're ready to call the bouncers. Meantime, one table over, you've got this big knacker, the big MasterChef judge. He's sitting over there, and he's got to have, the white wine has to come with the starter, and then the red one has to come with the main. And it's a whole business, and you've got to know exactly at which point do you add the dressing to the salad. And he starts to tell you all these things about how you can taste the infusion of this and a hint of that and a garnish of the next thing. And it's a whole business over here, and it's, what do they call it? Degustation. You don't have big portions. You've got these little minuscule things. You have a little bit of this and you have a little bit of that, and it comes in a slider and it comes in a hin and a hair and a whole business. So you now look at these two individuals and you ask yourself the question, which of these two individuals is having a more primal experience? Or to put it differently, which of the two is having a more animal experience? The beggar who's stuffing his face, or the highly acclaimed chef, restaurant critic, whatever he is, who's doing a full analysis of every spoonful of food? So who's having the more animalistic experience? So your gut would immediately say, the beggar, look at him, he's behaving like an animal. Animals also don't eat with silverware. They also don't have, the finesse. They eat, they stuff their face. That's what he's doing, he's stuffing his face like an animal. And you'd be right. You'd be right. Because this person's life has been reduced to such a basic level of survival that he doesn't have the Maslow's capacity for finesse. The dabbing with the whatever, just eating. The thing is, the person who's this big expert on food isn't just eating. They're investing their higher faculties in the animal experience. Meaning to say, the beggar, for all we know, could be somebody who at some point in life just had bad fortune, might be a genius for all we know. Might be somebody who once upon a time was the CEO of a large company and maybe they got taken out in the tech crash of whatever it was, 2016 or whatever it was. Right? Bad luck. And they just never got back in the game. So it could be that this person, while sleeping under the stars, is thinking about different ideas, entrepreneurial ideas, and what they would do if they had a second chance. But their mind is completely beyond the experience of stuffing their face. Yes, they're eating like an animal because that's what they've been reduced to. But they don't schlep themselves into the animal experience. The other person has taken higher faculties of the human being, the ability to use your mind, the more advanced emotions, and put it all into the plate. So when we say zoilele basar v'soivei yayin, we're not only simply talking about how much or how unrefined the eating process is, how much food or how the person stuffs it down. We could also be talking about somebody who becomes totally consumed by the eating experience. Did you try this? Did you taste that? So-and-so makes it better, and so on and so forth. Because what they all have in common is there is no sense of higher purpose in the eating process. It is purely self-indulgent. So if a person eats a lot of meat and drinks a lot of wine, and he specifically uses these examples because they are both more extravagant foods. We're not talking over here about somebody who's eating in order to survive. Meat, through the whole of history until modern food processing plants and modern farming methods, meat was luxury. There were people who went their entire lives and never experienced red meat. Wine, and not because of some conscious choice of animal rights, because it just wasn't an option. Wine was the drink that you reserved for very special occasions. Not everybody had access to wine, so he's using more luxurious items over here because effectively he's showing us the degree of self-indulgence. So you've got the rabbi of the last piece who says the reason you eat meat and the reason you drink wine is that your mind can be calm and focused to be able to learn. That's one experience of eating meat and drinking wine. And here you have another one who says, I'm eating meat and drinking wine. Why? Because I'm an important person who needs to be satisfied. And if the steak comes out and it's not exactly the way I want it, I'm going to send it back. I don't think in 99% of history there was ever the option of sending it back. Right? It's a modern problem. Send it back. Call the chef. Tell them it's no good. So that indulgence, lemalos tavos gufay, fulfills two things. On the one hand, it fulfills the desire of the human body. That's like the beggar. The beggar needs to satisfy the urges of the human body. There are hunger pangs. I need to satisfy those hunger pangs. That's why I'm eating. But at the same time, there's also the drive and the need of the animal soul. That's already a more sophisticated part of the person. That's a part of myself that doesn't just want to dull the hunger pangs. That's a part of me that wants to have a good experience. That's a part of me that will send the steak back. Because if it was purely about feeding myself, no, if the steak isn't exactly as it was supposed to be, okay, as long as it fed me. But the nefesh habahamis, which is a more complex creature, that's the animalistic soul. Animalistic soul says, this is not of the standard that I approve of. So it's got to satisfy me. Shehu b'chinas yesoid hamayim mi'arba yesoidos haraim sheba shemimenu midas hatayva. Seeing as we're talking over here about this nefesh habahamis, about animal soul, so it's important for us to remember, and it's something that the Alter Rebbe, the author of Tanya, introduced to us in the first chapter, and that is that both of our souls, the positive godly soul and the not so positive animalistic soul, has four basic regions of operation, which align with the four basic elements of all of existence, which is fire, air, water, and earth. So back in chapter 1, he told us, I'm not going to go through all of them again, but just as an example, that fire, for example, in the Nefesh HaBahamis will translate into, for example, anger. It's not the only example, but an easy example to relate. So the fact that a person has a tendency to anger would imply that there is a stronger fire element to the Nefesh HaBahamis, to the animal soul. So when we were introduced to this what do we call it, a Tetris, this four-dimensional reality of the soul. So at that point we were told that water, the water dimension of the soul, is what precipitates desires. So he's re-identifying that for us. He's saying if you have a person who's got this hedonistic desire for food, it means that they probably have a dominant water character in their personality. Okay, because the water character is the person who is quite hedonistic, quite indulgent. And it is interesting, by the way, because everybody has their vices, and often those people who are the water personalities, which is, perhaps a little bit calmer than the fire personalities, quite often are the people who need their comfort food, and they need to feel that they have the things that satisfy them. It's quite interesting. I mean, it's not as black and white as that, but just to give an illustration. So effectively what's happening over here is you've got a person whose water dimension of the animal soul is at work over here, and it seems to be a dominant feature, and it's flooding them at this point in time, and that's why they say, I can't stop. Exactly like water, right? Sometimes once it's going, you feel like you can't stop. You can ask people in Paris, they'll tell you all about it at the moment. That unfortunately, your place is fine, right? So far. I mean, it's mamish, not a joke. You see how the force of water is actually frightening, absolutely frightening. Anyway, let's not get totally off topic over here. But the principle is that that's what happens sometimes, right? When you turn on the tap, you don't know how to turn it off. There's a very funny Afrikaans guy. I don't know if you've seen this. He's got a property on the Vaal, and I guess on the river bank, they've got one of those. Those taps that are just in the middle of nowhere? It's like a long pipe and then a tap at the top, like just in the middle of nowhere. So he takes a video of himself when this flooding began, and he's left the tap like as if it's dripping. And he says, I told you to close the tap. Now look what's happened. And you see the entire place is flooded. But actually, if you've ever had a leaking tap, and then you get your water bill at the end of the month, suddenly you realize, you know what? it's no joke, right? A little bit before you know it, the water actually amounts to a very large amount. Well, the flip side of that, by the way, is if you've ever, not that this happens to us living here, but if you've ever had a water outage, you know what that is? A water outage? And you've got to use your little buckets of water that you've collected in advance, or, they tell you they're going to repair a pipe, so you go prepare yourself. Then you suddenly realize how little water you actually need. We have no problem. Let the water flow. So that's the nature of water. It becomes very difficult. Once the channel is open, it becomes quite difficult to monitor, to measure, and to contain the flow. That's exactly what happens. So what does the person say? I'm just going to have one little taste of dessert. That's what we do, right? One little leaking tap of dessert. That's what we're going to do. So what happens? You have that first. No, it's not every day that you get to have this. Just a little bit more. I've been so good. So that's exactly what happens. The tap is open, and then it begins to flow. So that might be one of the reasons that we associate the indulgence, self-indulgence, or personal pleasure with the concept of water. There are other reasons as well, but that might just be one that I think is quite relatable. Once you've opened the valve, it's not so simple to shut it off again. What's relevant for our conversation tonight is not so much about how the mechanics of desire work, but rather what happens when a person interacts with a neutral part of their world based on desire. So there's a neutral part of the world that could go either way. That was the definition of klipas noga. Could go either way. It could become something that is incredibly holy. In fact, we used the expression that it could be elevated like a sacrifice in the temple, which is one of the highest modes of service of Hashem and connection to Hashem that is possible. What happens when a person doesn't take that opportunity and instead allows the process to guide them? So instead of being the master of the process, they are mastered by the process. Perhaps gives another meaning to the term master chef, yes? Either you're the master of the process or the process masters you. So if a person is not able to master the process and they start to get dragged in and sucked down into the experience of the desire associated with the process, so then what happens is, hinali dezeh yoreid chayos habasav hayayin shebekir boy. This is a really, really interesting concept. Earlier, wasn't today, it was yesterday, in a different shiur, we were talking about something similar, not exactly related, and somebody said, everything is holy because everything has a spark of God in it. Now that is not accurate. Not everything is holy, despite the fact that everything has a spark of God in it. Because our understanding, and it's a very important theme throughout the teachings of Jewish mysticism, whether it be Kabbalah or whether it be Hasidus, so we understand that in order for anything to exist, there has to be a godly spark in it, because the only true existence is God. So it wouldn't be possible for anything to exist without a spark of God in it. Nothing else is real. Nothing else can really survive. So everything must have a spark of God inside of it. And quite frankly, that doesn't mean a thing. For example, the table that you're sitting at right now, does it have a spark of God in it? The answer has to be yes. Because if it did not have a spark of God, there'd be no way for it to exist. Great. So is the table godly? It's a different question, very different question. And the answer to that has to be no. Now, if you find it difficult to distinguish between a spark of God in it and being godly, let's use a different example to illustrate it. The first revelation that Moshe has is the burning bush. Was God manifest to Moshe at the burning bush? Yes. Is the burning bush godly? So let's examine. Before the burning bush burns, what is it? A bush, like any other. There's absolutely nothing to distinguish it from the next bush half a meter away. when the burning bush is finished. So now Moshe's got his mission, and he's got to go back to Midian, and then from there to Egypt. And God has retracted the revelation at the burning bush. Is the burning bush now holy? In other words, does it have to be treated differently to any other bush that ever preceded it, to any other bush that's in the environment? No. That's the difference between having a godly spark and being godly. Godly means you can see this revelation happening. There was a period of time the burning bush became godly during the interaction between God and Moshe. And as soon as that interaction was over, the same burning bush was no longer godly, even though it still has a spark of God in it. Okay, so it's an excellent question, but I want to take one step before the Kotel, and that is Mount Sinai. So now, is Mount Sinai a godly or holy place? Today, let's bear in mind, the single greatest revelation of God in history happened at Mount Sinai. Is Mount Sinai holy? Is Mount Sinai godly? And the answer is, obviously not. How do you know it's not? How do you know it's not? Okay, let me ask you another question. Have you ever been to Mount Sinai? Yeah, you've been to Mount Sinai? Right? How many people are selling red strings at Mount Sinai? How many minions do they have a day at Mount Sinai? Right? Who's the rabbi of Mount Sinai? Like you have the rabbi of the Kotel. So what is Mount Sinai today? A tourist trap. Nobody can prove to you that this is actually where Mount Sinai was. They'll tell you this is Mount Sinai. We don't know. Why don't we know? Because nobody kept a record of it over all these years. Why not? Because it had no holy value. When God was speaking the 10 Commandments, at that point it was holy. At that point it was godly. And when it ended, it was no longer godly. Now let's talk about Jerusalem, or more specifically the Temple Mount, or the part of the Temple Mount that we all relate to, which is the outer wall called the Kotel. That is a place where Hashem did not come crashing down from heaven in this great revelation. So how did it become originally? How did it become a holy place? We made it holy. We did something to the place. That's exactly what we're describing over here. We walked into an environment that was an ordinary piece of earth that was indistinguishable from any other piece of earth on the globe. And we followed steps and instructions that were given to us by God of how to take this place and release the godly spark that's hidden inside it so that the place becomes godly. And if that happens, it can never be reversed. So even if there's no temple there anymore, it's still a holy place, because we've changed the DNA of the place. Okay, so now.
Would that be the same as a synagogue or a shul?
Okay, to a lesser degree, that would be exactly a shul. And that's why it was interesting to speak about this table, not the table of the people on Zoom, because that's not a table in a shul, but this is a table in a shul. So is it a godly table? Not necessarily. But a shul, so the halacha is, the verse says that God promises us, if we, God forbid, abandon Judaism, he will destroy our holy places, plural. And based on that, the Gemara says, even if the place is in ruins, it is still a holy place, and it applies that to all shuls. Okay, what's the practicality of it? Not so simple, but, right? Somebody just asked a question. At the time of the burning bush, Hashem told Moshe to take off his shoes because he was standing on holy ground. That's 100% correct at the time that the revelation took place. As soon as the revelation was over, it was no longer holy ground. Exactly like Mount Sinai, where the Torah says clearly, while the revelation takes place, you have to cordon off the mountain. Nobody is allowed to climb the mountain because it's holy. As soon as the shofar blows at the end, it is no longer holy. Everybody is allowed onto the mountain. So that illustrates to us that if there's a divine revelation that does not transform something to become holy, there's only one way to transform something into holiness, and that is through human endeavor. So now, that's an incredible insight. The only way you can transform something to become holy is through human effort. We've got to follow the steps mandated by the Torah, and then we can do it. And that's what he's saying. If a person has kosher food sitting in front of them, that means that that food has an accessible, godly spark inside of it. If I then approach that food following the mandate of the Torah, which is that you eat in a particular way, not just you have the food prepared for you in a particular way, because everybody thinks that's where kashrut ends, when it gets to my plate. But actually, I have to eat in a particular way, with a particular focus and intention and higher purpose, etc., then that food becomes permanently elevated into a state of holiness. Obviously, the food doesn't last forever, but the status of that food is irrevocably now holy. In this case, the case we're describing, which is where the person is hedonistic and indulgent, well then, what happens is instead of the food being holy, the godly spark that is inside that food, listen again to the words that he says, Yored chayus habasar v'hayayin, the life force, which is the godly spark that is inside that meat and is inside that wine, it's basically yored means it descends, but I don't know if descends is a word we can relate to, so it's relegated. And it gets trapped in the world of impurity. So, excuse the pun, but the stakes are high. In other words, it's not just a matter of I personally didn't get the value that I could have gotten had I eaten in a mindful way, and when I say mindful, I mean the Torah's version of mindfulness. So, had I eaten in a mindful way, I would have had an elevated experience, and I've just lost out on that experience, and it's unfortunate. It's actually much more serious than that. I've taken a bit of godly spark that exists in this world and trapped it in a place of impurity. Now you will notice that he uses the expression lefi sha'a. That will be a temporary state. So, if I get the eating process right, the fact that that food now becomes holy and godly is a permanent reality. If I get it wrong, and therefore as a result of that there's the spark of godliness that I've dragged down into impurity, by definition that cannot be permanent. By definition, I don't have the power to permanently disable Hashem's spark. So on the one hand, of course, it's a tremendous responsibility because, here I am, schlepping godliness down into a place of darkness. On the other hand, I need to recognize that it's temporary. So what does that mean? So he's going to explain. Now where's the food at this point? It's living inside me. So that means there's food inside my system that has a godly spark that is now trapped in darkness and impurity, and that's feeding me. That's my nutrition right now. That's what's coursing through my veins. That's what's keeping me alive. A highly toxic, well, it's spiritually toxic foodstuff is circulating through my bloodstream. But it's also lefisha. It's also a temporary thing. Ad asher yashuv ha'adam v'yachzer la'avodas Hashem u'le'toirasoi. I can change it like this by changing what I do with the energy inside. So again, here's a person who sits down to eat. What's the correct way from a Jewish perspective to sit down to eat? Is to say, I am now eating for the purpose of having nourishment, for the purpose of having energy, so that I could serve Hashem better. If I do that, I've elevated not only my personal experience, but the food itself, and everything about it is holy. I may as well be a kohen in the temple bringing a sacrifice. If I don't do that, which means I sit down, why am I eating? Because I'm hungry. Why am I eating this food? Because I love it. The food goes in a negative way, and it becomes, so to speak, spiritual overweight. Right? I've weighed down my neshama. But I could get up from that meal and sit down using the energy I've just put into my body to learn Torah, and that will free the trapped food. Because the fact is, it's now being used for a higher purpose. So that's a really interesting principle that we need to really think about, because most of us don't eat this way, that's for sure. Most of us are not even aware of the fact that there is such a concept of this spiritually conscious eating that Judaism teaches. So we don't know about it. But there's a tremendous, tremendous power that is available to us if we start to learn a different approach. Just asking, if we speak words of Torah at dinner, does it elevate the sparks? So it definitely, if a person is engaged at the time that they're eating, if they're also engaged in sharing words of Torah, that will elevate the sparks. But even that is not as great as having the intention, I am eating for the purpose of having the ability to do more of what Hashem wants. Okay, so it's quite a higher grade thing. It's very challenging to the way we're used to going about our lives. So a lot of food for thought, well, maybe thought for food, as the case might be. But really a lot that we could think of between now and next time. Okay, so I'm going to pause over there and see if anybody has questions or comments or whatever.